and welcome to the 18th episode, oh my goodness, of Mixed Media Reviews. My name is Kelsey, and today I'll be talking about a book, or more accurately, 2 books, or kind of a book and a half, something like that. This week's books are The Rise of Kyoshi and The Shadow of Kyoshi by F.C. Yee. So I got this second book for Christmas in 2020 because my husband didn't realize it was the second one. But I ended up purchasing the first one on my own and was able to read them both in April of 2021. I did not really know much about them since I didn't even know that they existed until I got the second one for Christmas. But obviously I figured out that they would be about Kyoshi, the Avatar, 2 generations before Aang. I have also found out, when doing research for this episode, that these books are now part of the Chronicles of Avatar, being books 1 and 2. Though this was announced back in January, I have not seen anything since then, so who knows when the next books will come out or what the avatars are going to be. But hopefully we get some more of that soon. The book covers are really beautiful. I loved them so much. The first one is kind of gray with a black circle that looks drawn on by a brush, like an ink kind of a circle. Kyoshi is in the center with her fan in one hand and her green armored kimono with red eyeshadow and golden headdress really stand out. I love the green, emphasizing the Earth Kingdom with hints of yellow, which tend to be their color palette. The second book, Shadow of Kyoshi, is primarily red, which I think is nice because now we have the pairing of green and red matches up with the Fire Nation colors, which of course Kyoshi's, main companion is Rangi from the Fire Nation. And now we see on the cover Rangi standing next to Kyoshi with an ink circle that is now red, and they're just both so beautiful, so perfect for Avatar, for the era that it's supposed to take place in. I really like the covers. Last thing to know, I will try not to be too spoilery in big plot points. We'll see how well I stick to that, but I won't really discuss too much about the second book because of that, and because I think I'm more talking about the overall kind of broad strokes of the book, like the characters and the world building that gets added on, and I won't go into too much detail. Again, there's going to be some spoilers, but this probably won't be as detailed as some of my other book reviews, seeing as I have read them almost a year ago, and I remember things, but I mostly remember the big things. So yeah, let's continue with that in mind. For the summary, I'm only going to be reading the summary on the first book, and it is as follows. After 9 years of desperate searching for the next Avatar, the discovery of young, charming Avatar Yun has brought stability to the 4 nations. That is, until Earth Kingdom-born Kyoshi, Yun's unassuming friend and servant, demonstrates remarkable bending during a mission to the South Pole. With the identity of the true Avatar at stake and the growing unrest among her allies turning into violence, Kyoshi is forced to flee the Avatar mansion with her fiery friend Rangi, taking little more than the metal war fans and headdress her parents left behind. It isn't easy finding Avatar training on the run, but Kyoshi and Rangi find unlikely supporters in the Dao Fei, ragtag criminals and outlaws living in the shadows of the Earth Kingdom. Torn between following the traditional path of an Avatar and seeking vengeance for those she has lost, Kyoshi struggles to accept her newfound power as she trains in secret. But while Kyoshi, Rangi, and her Dao Fei friends face off against brutal underworld rivals, those who seek to control the Avatar draw ever closer to her, leaving trails of the dead in their wake. The story behind the longest living Avatar in the history of this beloved world, The Rise of Kyoshi, maps Kyoshi's journey from a girl of humble origins to the merciless pursuer of justice she still feared and admired centuries after becoming the Avatar. It's a long summary in the dust jacket, and that's why I'm only reading the first book. Oh my goodness, I absolutely loved these books. How could anyone not love them? I was just itching for more Avatar after completing the series and, attempting the movie, which we will just continue to talk quietly about. These books really filled up that void in my heart. Not only are they really well written just in their own right, they're also just great extensions of the Avatar world. As you're all very much aware of by now, Avatar is such a great show because of the detail and the effort that they put into it, and these books do the same. We get such a vibrant worldview with Kyoshi, with even more info about what the world was like when she was alive and what her life was like discovering she was the Avatar. I loved Kyoshi. I loved that she wasn't a perfect person. Over the course of both books, we see that just because she's the Avatar doesn't mean she's perfect. It doesn't mean she's, Zen or the best human being. She makes mistakes. She gets angry and she does bad things sometimes. Kyoshi was such a good character to explore, and I love that she is so different from the avatars we saw on the screen. She wasn't as innocent as Aang, and she wasn't great at bending in the beginning like Korra was. In the beginning, Kyoshi was a servant and could not even bend the earth very well, which was her own element. Only being able to bend large objects with very little control. I liked that we see an avatar that wasn't very proficient in their own element. We see that, Aang was a master at airbending when he was just a child, and Korra, which we'll talk about more in the next episode, was able to bend water well and could even bend a few others as a child. Kyoshi's rise, to her legendary status was very much earned with that hard work. She rose from being a forgotten orphan that was mistreated by an entire village to an avatar that struck fear in the hearts of others and lived for a couple centuries. Rangi is another great character in the book. At first, she's just the bodyguard of Yun, the person, originally thought to be the Avatar, but ended up becoming close friends with both him and Kyoshi, who was at the time still a servant for Yun. When Kyoshi is in danger after she first discovers that she's the Avatar, she flees with her and becomes Kyoshi's bodyguard. Not that Kyoshi really needs a bodyguard. Rangi also began to train Kyoshi on firebending, and she really pushed her to her limits. Rangi was an expert firebender, having trained not only from her mother, who trained the previous Avatar Kuruk, but also trained as a Fire Nation soldier, being in a family that is basically the family that trains firebenders. So obviously, she was a great fighter. Even without the bending, she was great at fighting. Being able to take down a champion of a Lei Tai arena, Rangi was super loyal to Kyoshi too, joining up with the Dao Fei even though she was not at all about that criminal life. See her family. She also kind of mirrored Kyoshi by being prone to violence as well, and we constantly see her standing her ground. She was a strong person, not just a strong fighter. I also really liked Kelsong, I think you say. He was a great mentor for Kyoshi, and he was the first person to really care about her, and was the reason she was able to work in the Avatar's mansion to begin with, and not just continue to live on the streets, ignored by the rest of the village. He also recognized the great power within her, and was the one to kind of piece together thinking she was probably the actual real Avatar and not Yun. He was like a father figure to her, and I really liked him. He was an airbender, and he was the airbender teacher for the previous Avatar, Kuruk. And as you can probably hear, there's a dog barking in the background, but it won't stop barking, so this is just going to be your life now. What else? Oh, of course we can't forget about Pung Pung, which I pronounced it Pang Pang, but when I looked up all these pronunciations, it's apparently Pung Pung. I think I'm probably still saying it wrong, but I loved him. Love flying bison, so I'm glad we got one in this story. He was originally Kelsong's flying bison, and when Kyoshi and Rangi fled, they ended up taking Pung Pung with them. I really, really like the juxtaposition of Kyoshi with Aang and Korra. Kyoshi is rough around the edges. She's a very tall, super tall, like taller than the guys that were very tall at the time. Very tall girl. She's an orphan. Her parents were criminals. She learned from bending from criminals. She was much more prone to violence than we've seen. Korra kind of was the same, quick to act. And she was unable to control her own element. When we see her use avatar level power, it's very chaotic at first, which is similar to Aang when he first was in his avatar state and he couldn't control it. But I really liked seeing her learn all the different elements from the Dao Fei, which was a connection with her parents, even though she hates them. And it's probably actually where she learns to live as long as she does, with the teachings of Lauga. But Kyoshi isn't polished. And while we obviously know that Aang wasn't very polished and Korra was not very polished either, we see a different unpolished version than we see in Aang and Korra. Kyoshi is learning on the run like Aang was, and Aang kind of got it where he could, the teachings, but he also went to specific places to learn from specific people in those places, right? He learned from somebody in the water tribe how to bend, who was, up there and who was known to be like a master waterbender. He learned firebending from technically an outlaw, I guess, but the prince of the Fire Nation, who would end up becoming the Lord of the Fire Nation. So he learned from people that were kind of more established. Even Toph was, from a prestigious family, whereas we see Rangi as really kind of Rangi, sorry. We see Rangi as really the only person that he learns from, who Kyoshi learns from, who is, I guess, part of that prestigious world that we normally see the Avatar learning from, right? Korra learns from the Aang's actual son and to figure out how to airbend. So Kyoshi isn't learning from people that, are known people, but instead this kind of ragtag group of criminals who have learned amazing feats, right? They learn dust stepping. They learn how to do all kinds of things because of the way that they use their powers criminally. So it was really nice to see such a different perspective and a different take on how the Avatar could learn and grow and discover kind of these ways to bend, right? I mean, Kyoshi can lava bend. That was something that's not very common and wasn't very common until we see in Korra's time. And, once again, we see a careful selection in the way the Avatar moves to control the elements, as well as, the other benders move. They're very detailed. The way that Yi was able to describe these moves and these gestures, it was always so clear in how their movements were. We didn't get the Last Airbender movie movements. We got something that was reminiscent of the shows, something that was, you could visualize, that had names, that gave proper names to the stances that they were doing, right? Rangi's always telling Kyoshi to get into horse position to test her strength and her endurance. So I really liked that he was able to tell us what was happening, and I don't think that we lost anything and only be able to read instead of see it. I especially love the description and the inclusion of dust stepping. And, again, she learns that from the Dao Fei. And much like the show, again, we continue to see strong female characters throughout. Kyoshi is definitely not the same as Aang. Again, she doesn't have the childlike innocence because she had a very different childhood. She didn't feel loved. She wasn't amongst her peers. She grew up alone and really only had one person for her, Kelsong, until she finally meets her friends later on when she's, like a teenager. To see her struggle with her powers but still become the strong woman who becomes one of the most respected avatars and feared avatars is huge. Having these strong female characters throughout the story, like Rangi, like Kirima, like Heiron, and not just as side characters, that's a huge deal. To have strong characters in general across the spectrum, in gender, orientation, race, background, etc., in shows and books that young people watch or read can really help create more tolerance, more accepting of people who are different. Which brings me to my next point. I love Kyoshi's love interest. That once again we have an LGBTQ plus character that feels completely natural within the setting, and that they aren't afraid to include them in big ways. These, again, aren't small characters, but literally the main characters. We see the same with Korra, which I'll talk about more in the next episode. And I'm sure it means a lot to young people and even adults who feel like they are being represented in a world that is magical, that they can exist there too. That is something that needs to happen more often. I'm glad Avatar is one universe where it hasn't been uncommon for it to occur. I know in a lot of fantasy novels, people don't tend to be people of color. It's only kind of shifting now that we see a lot more authors who are people of color who are bringing their voice into these stories. And so Avatar being in, the mid to late 2000s, already introducing these characters, and especially women characters in those roles, I think is really big. And I like that in this story we see that continuing. I also really liked learning more about the Earth Kingdom and the Fire Nation. Both were incredibly interesting, and we even got to learn a bit more about the Top Knot with Rangi, with some more Fire Nation and Earth Kingdom customs and their government and the way that their cities were set up. I feel like Fire Nation and the Earth Kingdom evolved a bit, but we still see a lot of that happening in the later series, in, Aang's lifetime, in Korra's lifetime. We also get more information about the Avatar before Kyoshi, Kuruk, and we see his companions, and we see his life, and we see kind of why Kuruk wasn't the best Avatar. And honestly, it's a pretty sad life. But yeah. In true Avatar fashion, there really isn't anything to critique. Gonna sit here and pretend to think, but in my head I'm just thinking about how awesome these books were, because they were awesome. And genuinely I can't remember being anything but enthralled by these books. They were just so well written on their own, and they brought so much more to the table, which is what you want in a book that's within an established universe. Maybe I'll just take a moment to once again say how terrible The Last Airbender movie was and how horrifically wrong they got all the bending. How can a book do a better job than a visual media? It doesn't make any sense. And I just feel so bad for all the people who had to act and be a part of that movie, because I'm sure the nightmares of it just never stop. Well, if you love the Avatar world, or even if you just like fantasy stuff, I definitely recommend reading the books. You don't even have to watch the shows to understand what's going on, to be honest. These books are just so freaking good, you guys. And by you guys, I just mean Asa, because he's my one listener. I am also very interested in FC's other books he's written outside of the Avatar world, because of just how well he did with an established universe. He just wrote so well. But that will probably have to wait until after my book buying ban is lifted. We'll see. Also, I'd love to read some Avatar comics, which maybe I could get away with buying because they're not technically books, right? But comics can also be very exhausting to keep up with. So, we'll see. I know I shouldn't, but I am genuinely hopeful about the live-action television show. It's at least a better sign that the creators are still on board at this point, so hopefully we get a much better... And it's like a show, right? So hopefully it's going to be a lot better. I mean, literally anything could be better than the movie. I mean, they literally don't even have to try, and it should be better. So, we'll see. And there you have it. those are my thoughts on the Kyoshi novels, which are now the first and second of the Chronicles of the Avatar series. Thank you so much for joining me. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Mixed Media Reviews Podcast, and you can also find me anywhere you find your podcasts, probably. Please join me next week where I'll be reviewing the TV show Legend of Korra, the conclusion to my Avatar series, until the live action comes out. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye!